today's video, we are going to be going through the process of syncing invoices, bills, expenses, and other types of source documents from True over to one of the desktop versions of QuickBooks, whether that's Pro, Premier, or Enterprise, including the Contractor versions of QuickBooks. So in order to enable that, what we've done is populated some data here in our demonstration copy of True, and I'm just going to be walking through how you get something to show up on the QuickBooks dashboard, which we've got over here on the left side of the screen, and how you actually go ahead and sync and what happens in both True and QuickBooks when that sync takes place. So if we look over here on the left, this is our QuickBooks dashboard, and you can get to this page from anywhere in True using this gear icon and then going to the QuickBooks tile. The dashboard has three different modes: export, update, and import. Export is going to be your tab used for sending data from True to QuickBooks. Update is going to allow you to take source documents that you've already synced to QuickBooks from True and sync updates to them. So if you've changed the dollar figures on an invoice or modified the customer or tax rate on a payment or a bill, then you can push those changes over to QuickBooks using the Update tab. And the Import tab is going to be where we pull data from QuickBooks into True. We're going to start with the Import tab here. Typically, this is something that will run for you. This is part of our onboarding process, is to pull in all sorts of list data from QuickBooks into True. So we typically start with your chart of accounts, and the import process is pretty straightforward. Now, you don't normally have to run this after the initial setup, but if you make changes to your chart of accounts or your products in QuickBooks and you want to pull those changes into True, you can always come in here at any time, select the module that you'd like to import, and run the import function here. You can get a prompt asking if you want to confirm that, so you hit yes. You're going to see our little connection icon open up there, and it's going to pull in the chart of accounts, the updated chart of accounts from QuickBooks. And when this finishes, we're going to see a listing of all of the accounts that we've pulled in, either as new accounts or updated from QuickBooks. Right, so let's take a look at that. So we can see now the full chart of accounts, including things like bank accounts and credit cards from QuickBooks, are being pulled in here. So many of these accounts we already had imported, but several of them are new as well. And if we take a look here in QuickBooks and compare our chart of accounts, we'll see the same exact list that we're seeing here on the left side matches what we're seeing in QuickBooks. Okay, so that's going to be how you bring in any changes, new accounts. If you want to change the settings on an existing chart of accounts item, you can import it there. The same thing is going to apply to all these other modules here. So you can bring in your product list, sales terms, classes if you're using them, departments if you're using the departments feature in QuickBooks, sales tax rates, your customer and vendor lists, which are going to be important. And then if you're using jobs in QuickBooks, you can pull those in as well. Now these last two here, payments and bill payments, you don't normally want to pull in all of your historical data from QuickBooks. When you're using True with QuickBooks, you're going to be running all your financial statements out of QuickBooks, so we don't normally need the historical data, but what these will allow you to do is if you are taking payments in QuickBooks or you are recording your payments, either writing checks or any other type of payment, and you're doing that directly in QuickBooks, you can pull in those payments and bill payments into True, and we're going to reflect the updated balances on whatever invoice those were applied to in QuickBooks or whatever bill they were applied to in QuickBooks. So you can do these two workflows in True. You can create your payments and bill payments in True and sync them over to QuickBooks. But if you're using QuickBooks for payment processing or check printing, you may want to just keep that side of your workflow in QuickBooks, and you can then import them periodically. When you run these imports, you're going to be prompted to enter a date range for the import, and so we'll only pull in payments and bill payments that fall within that particular date range. And we've already run the rest of these imports here, so we're gonna skip over running the rest of these, but all of the screens are gonna look exactly like what we're seeing here in the ledger accounts import, you may see some additional data here. So here we're just showing the ledger name. On some of these other imports, we'll show some additional data, such as the tax rate, for instance, or the sales term rate. But for the most part, it's just going to be the display information. And you can click over here in the options button if you want to view what we've just imported and maybe make changes to it in True. You can use the jump icon here. That's going to take you to the respective modules. So in this case, the chart of accounts and your company preferences, where you can make further changes to it, rename accounts, renumber them. Now those changes won't affect QuickBooks, but they will allow you to, for instance, rename things for convenience on the True side. And in QuickBooks, those changes won't be reflected. Certain modules, such as the chart of accounts, are import only. Many of these modules, such as products, payments, jobs, customers, and vendors, can be both imported and exported. So next, we're going to take a look at the Export tab here. And whenever you navigate to one of these tabs, we're going to requery all of these values over here. So you're going to see it's going to take a minute to just look through all of these modules and make sure we have up-to-date counts. While that's happening, we'll go ahead and take a look at how we actually get something to show up in this list here. So as we can see here, I don't have any customers available to sync, no vendors, no jobs, but we do have 2 invoices. So let's take a look at those 2 invoices and see what is it about them that flag them to show up here on the dashboard. So while that's pulling up over there, I'm going to switch over. This is our web version of True. And we'll go to the Invoices module here. So we can see we've got 2 invoices over here, invoice 32 and invoice 35. But over here on the right in our Invoices module, we're actually showing 5 different invoices here. So what we did to get these 2 invoices to show up in our QuickBooks dashboard as something that we could sync to QuickBooks is we've gone through an approval process. So all of our syncable modules have the same approval step that has to be taken before you can take something from True and send it over to QuickBooks, and that allows you to have data entry performed by someone who maybe you don't want to give them access to actually affect your financial statements. So you don't want them syncing over invoices or bills without performing some due diligence and verifying that those figures are correct and everything's coded correctly. So this approval step is a second step after the data entry is performed, where you're going to have another employee or the same employee come in and run an approval. So there's 2 different ways to do approvals. From every module where we have the syncing ability, you're going to see this accounting column here in the list view. And if we go into the detail view for a particular invoice, in the top right here, we're going to show that same accounting status. So these 2 that we were just looking at, 32 and 35, we can see that those are pending sync. So that means they've been approved. They haven't yet been synced. Now we can see these first 3 invoices here are all unapproved. Now in order to approve one of these, it's a very simple process. From the list view, you can approve batches by hitting the batch selection checkbox here, clicking our QuickBooks options, and our first option here is to approve the sync. So that's going to just get it to show up here on the left in our dashboard. The second option is to remove the approval. So if you've accidentally approved something or you've had a problem syncing it and you don't want to try and sync it again, you can remove the approval. You can also flag it to update. So this is for the second tab here, the update tab on the dashboard. If you've made a change to one of these invoices and you've already synced it to QuickBooks, you just flag it to update, and what that'll do is that'll cause that invoice to show up on our update tab instead of our export tab. That way we can just push changes over without creating a duplicate of the invoice in QuickBooks. And our last option here is to resync. So what this resync option does is if we've already synced an invoice to QuickBooks and for whatever reason we've had to delete it from QuickBooks, that delete doesn't automatically propagate back into True. So what you do is if you've deleted something that you synced to QuickBooks and now you need to sync it again, you're going to flag it for resync, And what that'll do is if this status was already in sync, it'll put it back in pending sync. So it'll allow you to sync a brand new copy of that source document over to QuickBooks. Usually you can accomplish the same thing using the update function, but there are some times where either certain things can't be changed in true once it's been synced, or you don't want to allow changes, so you don't want to allow updates at all. In that case, you're going to delete from QuickBooks and use the resync function. So we've got our two invoices here. They're both pending syncs. That's why they're both going to show up here on the left side on our QuickBooks dashboard. So in order to actually sync these, all you're going to do is either batch select one or more, or you can batch select all using the button at the top of the row here. And you'll see your sync button turns green when that happens. And then you just go ahead and click sync. You're going to get a confirmation window, hit yes there, and we're going to see this will go through and try and sync these invoices over. So one nice thing that True will do for you is you'll notice we have the option to do the same approval step for customers, vendors, and jobs and contracts as well. It's not necessary to separately approve a customer or a vendor or a job in order to sync it to QuickBooks. When you attempt to sync an invoice or a bill or anything that can be tied to another element, such as a customer, vendor, job, contract, product, True will automatically sync those for you as long as they're tied to a source document that you're trying to sync. So in this case, we didn't approve Tasha Harding here, our customer, to sync to QuickBooks, but True is going to go ahead and see that, okay, well, we're trying to sync this invoice and this customer doesn't exist in QuickBooks, so we're going to go ahead and sync the customer for you without having to have an explicit approval step. The same thing applies to jobs or contracts as well. So these invoices are both for, as we can see here on the right, this SO 2020-33. So if we look here in QuickBooks, now that our sync is completed, and we look at our customer list, we're going to see Tasha Harding right here with our SO number, SO 33. So this becomes a job in QuickBooks. This is a job in True. And our two invoices here show up. And if we take a closer look at some of these invoices, we're going to see that basically everything we have in True is going to transfer over to QuickBooks as long as there's an appropriate field for it. So we do track some information on the True side that we don't necessarily track or have the ability to track in QuickBooks. But anything where we have a field in True and there's an analogous field in QuickBooks, we're going to go ahead and sync that over. So what we can see here is we've got 5 line items on our invoice here. We end up with 5 line items on the invoice in QuickBooks. Some of these are tied to products, so our 13 windows and trim, 10 exterior trim and decks, and 17 insulation. These are products that came from QuickBooks. So we can see here the item that's being used comes from QuickBooks. Now these first 2 line items, though, these are not linked to a product. So this is one of the differences between True and QuickBooks. In QuickBooks, you can't have a line item that's not linked to a product. In True, we do allow that. So what happens is if you include a line item that is just an ad hoc line item, not tied to a specific product, we create this True non-inventory product in QuickBooks. It's a placeholder product. It uses your default AR account, your default inventory account, your default cost of goods sold account. So you'll want to change this, either use a product in True or change it once it syncs to QuickBooks if those are not the ledger accounts you want to use. In most cases, you're just going to want to use a product for everything because that's going to allow you to route your GL accounts correctly. But if you are okay just using your default revenue, inventory, and cost of goods sold accounts, you don't have to use a product in True. And you can see here in the description of these line items, we're pulling in the description that you have typed in here. So even though this isn't tied to a product in QuickBooks, it's still going to stay storefront. Quantities are going to pull over as they show in True. Same thing with the rate. In certain circumstances, this will get calculated automatically. For instance, we allow multiple rates on a single line item for labor type products. So you can have an on-site and an off-site rate. That's going to get computed to a single average rate when we sync to QuickBooks. And then if you have a tax rate set like we do on our details panel here using our Boston tax rate, that'll also show up in QuickBooks here. So we can see we've got our Massachusetts, Boston, 6.25%. Now, some of the things that won't sync over are activity log here. So this is true specific. We don't really have an analogous field in QuickBooks that we can use. Any attached files or notes that are in true, those aren't going to sync over. But many of the optional features in here will sync over. So our credit card fee, if we enter in a fee in true, that's going to show up as a separate line item here in QuickBooks. If we have a class selected that comes from QuickBooks, so here we have material costs, that's getting pulled over. Templates are not going to be, so we don't track templates in true, but this is primarily for generating your forms. So you have the option if you want to send the forms out of QuickBooks if you prefer their templates, but you can also send these out of true using our eForms module that'll allow you to generate a PDF copy that you can send out. So that's up to you which of the systems you want to do that from. It's not going to make a difference which one we choose. Okay. So that's our invoices sync, and we're going to find that most of these modules work the same way. So if we take a look next at pay requests in true, these are going to be your AIA style billing on contracts. In QuickBooks, we don't really have a pay request type source document. So what we do is we're gonna create these in QuickBooks as invoices, and our retention amount is going to show up on our invoice as a negative line item. So let's go ahead and sync these. And while those are syncing, I'm going to just show the approval process for pay applications. It's really similar to the Invoices module, but we're going to be in the contracts workflow rather than the jobs workflow. And we're going to be looking at our contracts list here in order to perform this approval. So all four of these here are for this Macintosh Complex 1 contract. So this is this contract here. And if we go into the Financial tab on the contract in our Pay Request sub-tab, we're going to see these four pay applications showing up here, and we can actually see the sync is completed. All four of them have synced, but we're seeing the same accounting column here. It's going to show the same statuses, so they're all going to start at unapproved. When you approve them, they're going to move to pending sync, and then as you can see, once the sync is completed, they're going to show up as synced. And all of our same QuickBooks options are going to show here when we batch select our QuickBooks tab here. And we have the same four options available that we saw in the Invoices module, all with the same function. So, okay, let's take a look then at QuickBooks side. Once we sync one of those pay applications over to QuickBooks, again, it's going to create a contract or a job in QuickBooks. So here, this is job 2020-4, and we can see here this is again a Tasha Harding job. And the job is synced over to QuickBooks here. Our four pay applications show up as invoices, and then on those pay applications, we're going to see a negative retention line. And we can see here we're using the true non-inventory product, but it is also possible to configure a specialized retention product in QuickBooks and use that instead. And that'll allow you to do things like route your AR account to a retention receivable account if you maintain a separate retention receivable account rather than using your default AR account. Okay. So that's going to be the AR side of things, primarily driven from invoices and pay applications. Next, we're going to take a look at some of our payments. So if we wanted to take a payment directly in true and then sync it over to QuickBooks, again, the process is very similar. So if we hop down here to our Payments tab on our dashboard, we're going to see we have one payment already approved. We'll take a look at that payment in true. And all your payments in true are going to be under this Financial tab here in the Transactions module. There are other ways to view a transaction in true. So if you go to a particular invoice, you can see a listing of all the payments, and you can approve those payments for that invoice right from that screen. But if you want to view all of your payments and bill payments throughout True, regardless of what invoice they're applied to or what bill they're applied to, You can do that from the transactions module here. So you can see here we've got a $60,000 payment. It's a TRX 2020-15. So we're going to pull that up here in the transactions module. Just search for that TRX number. Filter there. Okay, so here's our check. So we can see this is a check for one of those Tasha Harding jobs. This is actually for a pay application. So one of the pay apps we just synced here. Took this one. Okay, so and this is already approved, so we're pending sync here. So we want to sync this over to QuickBooks again, really similar to Invoices and pay applications. Just going to select it, sync batch there, and that's going to sync it over to QuickBooks so we can see it shows up right away, and our invoice balance is going to be updated. So if we look at this invoice here, we now have a 0 balance. So it's synced the payment over, applied it to the appropriate source document. The same thing happens if you go the other way. So if we have an invoice in QuickBooks and we put the payment in QuickBooks and you bring it into True, it's going to show up as applied to that source document in True. Now, one thing we haven't seen here due to our testers' diligent data entry is we haven't run into any error messages yet. If we did, you would see those error messages right here where we're seeing this status OK. So this is normally where an error would show up. Status OK is telling us that our sync went through without any issues. But if you did have an error message, it'll show up right here on this bottom row, and it's going to be in red if it's an error. And you can always see more information about these by clicking on this row here. So we'll see our sync log entry here is going to tell us what we attempted to do. So we created a payment. It's from the payments module. This is our record identifier, our TRX number. In this case, if there was an error, whatever that type of error would be is going to show up here. Any error code numbers, and then our full error message. And these error messages can get quite long, so sometimes they'll get cut off here on this bottom row. We won't be able to show the whole thing. So you can always open up this page here and see the full error details. So next up, we're going to take a look at the bills module. And on the True side, that's going to be under the procurement workflow and under the bills module here. Okay, so we're going to see we have 7 bills here, and we can see right away got our 7 bills pending sync over here, and a couple bills that are still unapproved. Syncing your bills, again, it's going to be the same exact workflow. When you create the bill, you have the option to approve it from the list view here in a batch. These are our QuickBooks tiles. You can also approve these one by one if you prefer, if you have to look into it and do some validation before you sync it or approve it. From the bills detail page, you can see right up here in the top right corner, those same 4 tiles to perform those actions for just this one bill. And then again, the sync process is going to be exactly the same. We're just going to select all of these. Similar to syncing invoices, if we sync a bill and the vendor doesn't exist in QuickBooks, we're going to create it automatically for you. So let's go ahead and sync those over, and we'll see if we pull up our vendor list here real quick. Actually see all those just popping right into QuickBooks. All right, so we've got our Home Depot, Drill Spot, Lowe's. So we can see all our vendors showing up here. And if we look into each of these, we're going to see our bills showing up there. Now, our bills in True are, just like in QuickBooks, can be itemized either by product or by expense account. By default, we're gonna itemize by an expense account, but if the bill is linked to a purchase order and that purchase order is linked to a product from QuickBooks, then it will get itemized. And what that'll allow you to do is keep track of your inventory correctly. But in this case, we just got a manual bill line item here. So you're going to do a manual line item when you just want to itemize by expense account. So we can see here we're just taking our $11,851 and putting it in our workers' comp account here. If we look at some of our other bills, similar, I think we have one here. Perfect. All right, so if we look at our drill spot bill here, this one is going to be itemized by product. So we can pull it up here, and this is bill 315035. Okay. So this bill here is going to be using class settings that come from the product. It's going to be using the ledger accounts that you specify on each row here, and our dollar amounts are shown up there. Okay, so next up we're going to have bill payments, and we can see here a little bit different. So this time, instead of going to the transactions module, we'll actually go to our bill directly and go to the payments tab and approve our payment that way. So if we scroll through our bills here, I think we've got a payment already on one of these. And it's going to be TRX 13 for 39,000. So that's going to be our drill spot. So on our bill here, you can see we've got bill 5, which we just synced over to the drill spot vendor here. 5, so that's our 1544 13 right here. And we've got a payment showing up here as pending sync. Okay, so if this hadn't already been approved, you could go to the transactions module and search for this TRX number and approve it. The other thing you can do, you can come right to the bill and select it on the payments mode here, and you have all those same QuickBooks options right there. So you can approve it right from the bill. You don't have to jump around the system to find it. Once it's approved, same thing as the payments module here. You're just going to select it and sync it. And again, both payments and bill payments, you can just put them directly into True or directly into QuickBooks and import them into True. Obviously, just like we're looking at here, we can put them into True and sync them to QuickBooks as well. And that's just going to depend on what you're more comfortable with. And you can mix and match. We recommend you just choose one system. It's easier to keep track of that way, but it's not going to cause any issues if you do some in True and some in QuickBooks. It's just going to be up to you to manage the syncs appropriately if that's the case. So trying to sync our payment here, we've actually run into our first sync error. Perfect. So we can see here, really simple error message. We are missing a vendor on our transaction. And we look at the detail here, we're actually missing some other stuff too. We don't have an invoice date, we don't have an invoice due date, and we're missing some line items on our bill. Okay, so we've got a bunch of errors going on trying to sync this this payment over. So at this point, there's a couple different ways you can try and fix something like this. The easiest way is you're just going to go right here and hit jump, and that'll take you to the transactions module. Pull up this transaction, and we can make any changes that we need to. The other thing we can do is, if we're looking at it right here, we may be able to fix some of those fields. So if we were missing a dollar amount or something like that, we can try and sync it. But probably what we're going to want to do is go to the financial workflow, go to transactions, and hold it up there. So let's see, just drop the TRX number in here. Make sure you hit the hyphen and not the plus button, and it'll pull right up for it. So then any issues with this, you go ahead and correct either right from this screen or from our edit panel to view more details about it, and you can go ahead and correct those and try and sync it again. And our last module that we're going to be doing a test sync on here is going to be the expenses module. And in True, this is again going to show up under procurement. So this is bills and expenses are going to be your two AP modules. So if we go into expenses here, this is going to be for recording things like credit card purchases, checks that were written to a vendor, but you don't necessarily have an invoice from that vendor, petty cash purchases, anything where we don't have a bill that we're receiving from the vendor, but we're still paying out by one method or another. And we can see here we've got a bunch of expenses in here, but we've got our 4 pending sync right here at the bottom. Now, when we go to sync one of these, again, you're going to see all the same elements that we saw in those other modules. The accounting column here showing you the current status. If we batch select these, we're going to see our QuickBooks options again. And if we want to do this one by one, over here we have our pending sync file. So a little bit different than some of the other modules, just in the way it's displayed, but you have all the same options to you. So if we want to go ahead and sync these, select them all, and these are going to show up in QuickBooks in potentially a couple of different places, and that's due to the way that they're set up. So these 4 here are all going to show in our check register, and the reason for that is that if we take a look at these, we're paying these out of a bank account. So because we've selected a bank account here, that's going to inform QuickBooks that this is a check or a check-like transaction. So this is going to show up in QuickBooks if we take a look at our check register. And here they are. So we've got our $57, $66, $37, and $68 all showing up in our check register. If we had picked a credit card here instead of a bank account, then rather than showing up in the check register, these are going to show up under your either under your statement charges, or depending on how you enter them, they could potentially show up directly on your statements. Okay. And then there are some other modules that we have available to sync. Now these aren't necessarily heavily used, but if you are using some of these features, it is available to you. So we can sync time clock data from True to QuickBooks, and those are going to become time activity records in QuickBooks. These depend heavily on the way you have your QuickBooks file set up, so we don't have an example sync here, but typically what they'll require is that you approve your punches in True, and then go through your punch list and assign a punch activity code from QuickBooks to each punch. And once you've done that, then we can go ahead and sync them. This is also going to prompt you to enter a date range to perform your sync for. Then some of the modules that we talked about briefly but glossed over are up here at the top. So customers, vendors, jobs, contracts, and products. These you don't typically have to explicitly tell True to sync, but if you are using some of the features in QuickBooks that can benefit from syncing these early, then you certainly can do that. So if we went to the directory here to sync a customer or a vendor, you'll see on the client and vendor list the same options that we have elsewhere. We can batch select these and go to approve them. That's going to force True to sync them early. So by default, we'll sync these when you create an invoice or a bill that uses the customer or vendor and job or contract. You can sync them early, and the main reason why you would want to do that is if you're using T-sheets in QuickBooks and you need to have those jobs in the system in order for you guys to punch in and out to those jobs using T-sheets. What you would do is you'd go to the jobs module or the contracts module, run the approval step, sync them to QuickBooks. They're not going to have any financial data behind them, but you will be able to use them to clock in and out using the T-sheets timekeeping app. Very briefly, the other thing we're going to look at here is the update page. So what this, we've already briefly covered what this does. So if we make changes to a source document, we want those changes to be reflected in QuickBooks. You flag them for an update, and then you can go ahead and go to the update tab here. And we can see here, this is a limited list here that we can do this for. So bills, bill payments, invoices, pay applications and payments, and then expenses. So if you make changes to any one of these modules for something you've already synced, then you can flag them for an update and then sync them right from this page. Instead of creating a new invoice or bill in QuickBooks, it'll just update the existing bill or invoice or whatever source document you happen to be updating. And that way you don't have to make your changes manually in both systems. So that is the full extent of all the different syncs that we have available. We do add new syncs all the time. So one of the new syncs that we're currently working on adding is adding the ability to sync inventory receipts to QuickBooks. That's going to be coming soon. We do have a way to track that in True currently, but we don't have the ability to sync that. So that's going to be coming in one of our upcoming updates sometime soon here. One of the other modules we didn't really touch on, but can be used heavily depending on the company, is our credit memos. So these work just like payments and bill payments in True. You can create them in either True or QuickBooks, import them or export them depending on which way you choose to do it. So they work exactly like payments and bill payments. They're typically used if your company takes deposits or down payments frequently. That's where we find the most use for credit memos. But there are obviously other situations if you're issuing or receiving credit to a customer or a vendor. You can also use the credit memo system to sync that information back and forth. So now focusing a little bit more on the QuickBooks side of things and looking at what we just synced over. One of the primary concerns when we're syncing data from True to QuickBooks is how is our GL mapping getting done? How are we determining how our journal entries look? Revenue accounts are we hitting? What AR or AP accounts are we using? That's primarily driven by two different sets of rules. So the first one is any source document, such as an invoice, pay application, or bill, that is itemized by product, your GL routing is going to be 100% determined by the way that you have your products configured in QuickBooks. So if we look at our item list here, our products in QuickBooks, we can see, okay, we've got several products in here. If we use one of these products in True, for instance, I believe we used our insulation product here in one of our invoices. When we sync that over to QuickBooks, QuickBooks is going to create a journal entry based on the settings that we're looking at right here. So if we wanted to change the expense account, the cost of goods sold account that gets used, we would change that right here. And you can do this in True as well. Same thing with our income account. So when we sell this item, what account are we going to be using? That's determined by our income account here. Depending on the type of product, you'll have different options here. So sometimes you'll see a cost of goods sold account, sometimes you won't. That just depends on the type of product, whether it's a service, inventory item, or non-inventory item. So this one here is a service, so we're going to get a generic expense and revenue account. So any of our source documents that are itemized by product, this is how the GL entry is going to be generated. Now, for certain other types of entries, we can determine those using settings in True. So the primary options for that are going to be bills, which can be overridden on the line item level to use a different expense account. And that's primarily used for bills that are not itemized by product, such as a utilities bill, a bill for a purchase that for anything other than inventory, really, you're going to be specifying manually the expense account that you want to use. And same thing applies to the expenses module, where you're going to be selecting a single expense account to use for that particular purchase. Certain modules, we are also using our second set of settings, which is going to be your company preferences. So up here in the gear icon, your company preferences, if we take a look at our chart of accounts here, which is up here at the top, and then our second tab here is our default accounts. So if we don't use a product, then what we're going to do is look at your default account list. What this allows you to do is specify a whole host of accounts that we'll use by default if there is no other setting. Many of these don't apply to QuickBooks. These are primarily for True accounting journal entries, but some of these, and you can see them here, the ones that I have set, are used for QuickBooks quite heavily. So when you sync, for instance, an invoice or a pay application, the AR account that gets used is determined by the default AR account right here. So here we're just using our generic accounts receivable account. You can set this to whatever you'd like. Next up, our default revenue account. This is more rarely used, but it is used when generating our True placeholder products. So whatever you want your uncategorized revenues to go towards. So this would be revenues for things that are not products in QuickBooks. This would be the account that you're going to set here. So here we have it set to our generic job income account. In many cases, you'll probably want to assign this to either a temporary account, one that you don't expect to actually have a balance, so anything that's in that account you're going to want to shift and reclassify to other accounts. Or if you do have a true generic revenue account you want to accrue this under, maybe like a miscellaneous or other income account, you can use that as well. And then our cost of goods sold account, again, this is going to be primarily driven by the product that is used on a particular line item, but when we create our placeholder product, this is the cost of goods sold account that we're going to use. So very similar to the default revenue account, many of our customers will choose to use an unclassified cost of goods sold, something along those lines, where it may have to be reviewed at month end and reclassified to a different account, but it can be used as a catch-all. And the only other account here that you may occasionally use is going to be your AP account and inventory account. So similar to how we use the AR account when syncing invoices, we'll use the default AP account when syncing bills. You can leave this empty. You can see here we did leave this empty and we were able to sync those bills with no problem. If you do that, then what's going to happen is QuickBooks will decide what AP account to use. Typically, they're just going to use the first AP account in your chart of accounts. And the same thing applies to inventory. Again, much like cost of goods sold and revenue, these are determined on the product level in QuickBooks, but for our true default product, this is the account we use. Okay, so there's several other accounts here. They mostly are going to be ignored. The only other account that may occasionally come up would be your default cash account. If you leave this empty, QuickBooks is most likely going to use your undeposited funds account if you have one. If you don't, it's going to use the first bank account in your chart of accounts. So it's a good practice to fill all these out, but not all of them are required. If they're empty, True will typically just try and let QuickBooks come up with it. Not all of them can be done that way, but if you fill out what we have filled out here, you're going to avoid most of the issues you could run into there. And that is our complete overview on the syncing process and procedures from True to QuickBooks. We also have new modules being added for syncing all the time. So if you don't see something on the QuickBooks dashboard now, it doesn't mean that we will never support it, but it doesn't mean that it's not something we currently support. We add these all the time, typically on a weekly, bi-weekly basis as needed.